Well, hello everybody, and welcome to everyone who is joining us from around the world. We are delighted to welcome you to this exclusive Nautilus Federation webinar for participants of the Mapping Our Maritime Future survey. My name is Helen Kelly, and I will be your host for today's event. On behalf of the Nautilus Federation, thank you for joining us as we unveil this comprehensive study that sheds light on seafarers' attitudes towards and experience of the moves to decarbonisation, increased use of automation on board, the need for better skills and training, and of course their attitudes towards pay and conditions. Before we dive into the programme, a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded and you'll have access to the recording via Nautilus TV on YouTube after the event. We invite you to participate in the live Q&A session at the end of the presentations, where you can pose your questions directly to our speakers. To do this, simply type your questions into the Q&A box during the event. The Nautilus Federation operates a dignity and respect policy for all our events that ensures all participants engage in safe, inclusive and respectful environment. Participants are encouraged to engage constructively, share ideas and ask questions in a way that promotes dialogue. Now, to kick off our webinar, it is my great pleasure to introduce Nautilus Federation Director, Mark Dickinson. Mark will be sharing his insights on the broader implications of this report and what it means for seafarers in the industry moving forward. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, Helen, I'm sure you've set me up to fail there because I'm sure I've only got 5 minutes in which to achieve all of that you've just said. But welcome anyway from our Swiss office. I've been in Basel the past couple of days for our annual branch conference and various other meetings, including an industry symposium, not on this subject, but on another important subject. So it's great to join you and good to see so many people here on this important webinar. Thanks, Helen, for the introduction. Now, you may have heard this quote before, and apologies for reusing it, but I think there's no better quote to start a discussion around a future that's going to be driven by decarbonisation and the journey towards net zero by saying that there are no jobs on a dead planet. I think that is, genuinely understood that now is the time for action, and we are in an industry that makes a very significant contribution towards global heating, and therefore, as an industry, we have to take the challenges seriously, and we have to start action now to address that and support that journey towards decarbonisation. What are we in the Federation campaigning and lobbying for? Well, we're lobbying and campaigning for a just transition in which maritime professionals can secure their futures, their jobs and their careers, where their jobs and conditions can support their livelihoods in a sustainable way, a transition that is fair and just and leaves no one behind. So that's about protecting their jobs, their skills now and the skills they will need in the future to deal with the environmental challenges that are coming, the wave of new legislation, and of course, crucially, the drive towards adopting alternative fuels, dealing with the technology, with the equipment, having the skills to do that safely. So that's what a just transition is for. It's essential. And most, if not everyone that we engage with in the industry seems to be talking the same language around that just transition. There's a general and broad recognition that a just transition is needed, and it's fair and it's proper and it's right. Crucial to that, of course, will be the fact that those new skills that the seafarers will need to sustain their careers in this rapidly changing industry do not come at a cost to the seafarer. We've seen transitions before. We've seen the reviews of STCW convention where the cost of the retraining has fallen too often on the seafarers themselves. But in this context and in this scenario of a just transition, that is not what we want. And it seems to be broadly accepted that that's the correct position. Who will pay? There is much discussion about that. But for us, it's not the seafarers, it's not the maritime professionals. So what this survey seeks to achieve, we launched this at our our board meeting of the Nautilus Federation that took place in Liverpool after the general meeting of Nautilus International last year. We launched this survey to garner the views and perspectives from our membership, our collective membership of the Nautilus Federation. And it's clear from the results that there is a job to do. There's a job of work to do to convince our members that this just transition is achievable. There's a lot of skepticism out there, as you'll see from the results, and Danny will take us through those shortly. Our members have concerns about the future, about their careers, and about the shift to alternative fuels. But what is absolutely clear from the results, for us, our core challenge is, first of all, to listen, which this report is a key moment for us to garner those views, and then they must be heard. And that's our task then, collectively, to take that forward and represent the findings of the survey to the policymakers and the regulators, to the IMO, to the various international organizations where we can progress the just transition to make sure that it is delivered and benefits members. And the just transition, as the report findings set out clearly, is much broader than just training and just adapting to new regulation and new fuels. It's also about fairness in the workplace, improving living and working conditions. We are facing a recruitment and retention crisis, as the report makes clear, and without seafarers who are motivated and remunerated appropriately for their skills and their commitment and professionalism, then there will be no industry. The industry can't survive, despite perhaps what some would say about technology and AI, et cetera, That's an issue for another day. Without the maritime professionals, this industry can't prosper and survive. I think that's probably more than 5 minutes, Helen. So hopefully I've set this up nicely. We've had it's a really interesting report, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the weeds a bit more as we progress over the next hour. So enough from me. Thank you, Helen. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, it is a really interesting report, and I was really pleased that we got such a strong response from our Nautilus Federation affiliates and their members as well. So thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Danny McGowan, Head of International Relations at Nautilus International and Coordinator of the Nautilus Federation, who will walk us through the findings of the report in more detail. So Danny, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'll just share my screen so you have that ready to display. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you very much for the introduction, Helen and Mark, for that sort of lead up to the report that we have here following the survey on the just transition. As Mark sort of alluded to in his introduction, the industry is at a crossroads, and some would say on the verge of an industrial revolution. Thanks to the foresight of the board of the Nautilus Federation, we undertook this survey to develop our understanding and, importantly, to share with our members and with industry the future of maritime in the context of this revolution. We want to ensure a just transition for maritime professionals over the next 10, 20, 30 years and beyond. There are a number of different targets and scenarios currently being discussed everywhere from the International Maritime Organization to the United Nations Global Compact, and many national administrations are also bringing this conversation forward as an area of important work. And whilst the work we have been undertaking in those forums alongside the International Transport Workers Federation has been important, we wanted to use our unique standing as a federation of maritime professionals to add some additional insight to this topic. Our survey consisted of 39 questions on decarbonisation, net zero, pay and conditions, and training and skills and automation, and received 878 responses. The headline from our survey is this: 1 in 5 maritime professionals believe that net zero by 2050 is achievable. Now, I'd also be interested to hear what those watching this video think. Please add your thoughts in the Q&A function in Teams if you're watching live, or in the comments to this video if you're watching later on. We think that this figure of 1 in 5 indicates a disconnect between those who are making the policies and those who will implement the measures. For that reason, it's all the more important that through this survey and now the report, we can insert together the seafarer's voice in the transition to net zero. With the IMO agreeing to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and the European Union going even further than this, that 1 in 5 figure that I mentioned just now is an important topic that together we'll need to overcome. However, this is clearly not down to a lack of enthusiasm for change, as you'll see in the next slide. More than 3/4 of respondents to our survey said that they welcome efforts to decarbonise the industry, which is certainly encouraging. That said, some of the terms, the phrases, the language that they've been using, even in this presentation, but also throughout the lead up to this presentation, there's a lot of jargon that we need to be aware of. Already we've used phrases like net zero, decarbonisation, and just transition. Some respondents to this survey evidenced some cynicism in relation to these concepts, with many feeling that this change will be used to further cut costs or to introduce unwanted changes for an unprepared industry. That was also met with 67% of people being unsure what a just transition actually means. The International Labour Organization, the ILO, defines a just transition as greening the economy in a way that is fair and inclusive as possible to everyone concerned, creating decent work opportunities and leaving no one behind. We'll come back to leaving no one behind later on in this presentation. But the 67% statistic, whilst high, is not surprising, and again, it evidences the need for us to be clear what we are talking about when we are dealing with this topic. But being clear about the topic is not just for us as trade unions and as the Nautilus Federation, it's also for the employers. 59% of respondents said that their employer had not communicated with them their company's decarbonisation strategy, but 75% of them said that they feel they should be consulted about such measures. It is therefore essential that ship owners and operators engage in meaningful consultation with maritime professionals about the topic, including new ship design, retrofitting, and implementation of new technologies. So, on the topic of inserting the seafarer's voice in the transition to net zero, we have 2 recommendations. And again, I'd be really keen to hear the views of those watching this webinar on these recommendations. So please do add your thoughts and any questions or comments. As we said at the beginning of this presentation, the decarbonisation of the industry is somewhat of an industrial revolution. We would therefore be naive to think that such a revolution would not look at automation and artificial intelligence. So our survey included some questions on this topic too. With the maritime industry having long embraced technological developments, it's therefore unsurprising that 81% of the survey respondents believe automation to be inevitable. 72% of people have seen increased automation in the last decade, and 61% of respondents agreeing or strongly agree that this is a good idea. Nearly half of respondents, as you'll see in the next slide, however, think that automation is a threat. As we said, automation is not new, but the speed at which change is happening now, in the wider world of technology, but also in maritime, is quickening. It almost seems like there's an assumption from employers that automation will result in reduced numbers of crew and the reduced accommodation that would come with that. In the responses to this topic, seafarers evidenced a number of concerns about job security and skill erosion. The assumption of some employers relating to reduced crewing as a result of automation is not something that maritime professionals agree with, however. With the willingness to engage in automation, there is the opportunity for monotonous or time-consuming tasks to be undertaken by technology, allowing seafarers to focus on critical aspects of ship operations. It would also allow for a reduction in fatigue and provide us with an opportunity to deal with the long working hours culture that is embedded into shipping. 72% of the respondents agree or strongly agree that automation should therefore be used to reduce long working hours. So, on attitudes towards automation, we have 3 recommendations, focusing on strategy for automation, including ethical use, collaboration with seafarers being engaged in the development and deployment of artificial intelligence, and training being provided for maritime professionals to develop the skills needed to work alongside artificial intelligence systems. Again, an unsurprising desire of maritime professionals, indeed of all workers, I would imagine, is for good jobs, fair pay, and conditions. Some of the cynicism that we mentioned earlier extends to maritime professionals not being confident that this industrial revolution will improve their working lives. That is contrary to the idea of a just transition. On wages, for example, the majority of respondents felt that there would be no change or they would get worse. Over half of the respondents believe that crewing levels will worsen as a result of the just transition. Only 7% of respondents think that hours of work would improve, but nearly half of respondents think that connectivity would improve, a small positive in some of those statistics. But moving on to hours of rest, again, not surprising in the context of the long working hours culture that we've spoken about in this presentation, 93% of respondents feel that hours of rest will either not change or will worsen in the move towards net zero. As Nautilus Federation affiliates, we believe, therefore, that collective bargaining is one of the key elements to support social and employment rights. Governments must, where possible, support collective bargaining as it is essential to ensuring the just in the just transition. Our survey also asked maritime professionals if they would consider changing jobs to be part of a new and emerging sector. Nearly half of the respondents said that they would consider it. Evidencing some further positivity towards the concept, over a third of people said that they would change jobs because they wanted to be part of the change to the future of renewable energy. Other reasons for changing range from believing that there would be more jobs, newer vessels, and increased opportunities for progression in a new emerging sector. Other respondents felt that there would be more job security in newer sectors and that skills could be transferred within those sectors. We also asked respondents to rank their top concerns, and the top concerns when they were ranked would pay, job security, and workload and retention. Over 80% of the respondents to the survey have worked in the maritime industry for more than 10 years. Nearly half of them say they have no desire to leave. For employers, therefore, this should indicate a good opportunity to retain a skilled workforce if they offer decent pay and conditions. As Nautilus Federation affiliates, we believe that the weakening of employment terms and conditions is as a direct result of the rise of flags of convenience, FOCs, and social dumping. With that in mind, these are our recommendations on good jobs, fair pay, and conditions. We need to support collective bargaining to strengthen employment rights and protections. Flags of convenience must be tackled, and we must explore cabotage opportunities and review ship registration practices. The Maritime Labour Convention must also be continuously improved for the benefit of all seafarers. And again, I'll ask those taking part in the webinar to add your thoughts to the Q&A, and those watching this video later to add your comments to the video on these recommendations. So I would now like to move on to the final sections of our report, and that's on future-proofing skills and training. Training for maritime professionals is at the very centre of the transition to a decarbonised shipping industry. Based on projections by DNV, the number of seafarers working on alternative fuel vessels will rise sharply up to the year 2038. However, 40% of the survey respondents report that they do not currently have enough information to understand the industry's transition, with a further 19% being unsure. That shows that a lot needs to be done to inform and educate maritime professionals about decarbonisation. Again, that's not particularly surprising to us, because only 17% of the respondents to this survey have worked on board a vessel powered by a new energy source, and of those, only 60% have received training provided by their company. And so this is where we come back to the just element of the just transition. 98% of maritime professionals feel that the employer or the government should pay for reskilling or retraining in the move to renewable alternatives. Respondents also believe that time must be given for maritime professionals to undertake training, with it being essential that that training is not undertaken during hours of rest or during shore leave. This figure is really important, considering that 40% of respondents reported that training currently takes place in their own time or during rest hours on board or ashore. This is very worrying, considering especially the World Maritime University's research on the culture of adjustment, showing that such practices can lead to fatigue and have negative impacts on safety. We heard the phrase earlier that no one should be left behind. With the review into STCW underway, it's essential that national governments ensure that technological change does not outpace minimum training standards. There must also be recognition that, as with any major change, there will be some who are unable to make the transition. For the transition to be just, national governments must therefore set up funds to support seafarers who are unable to retrain or upskill. That will assist those workers to find new careers or to enter retirement. There is precedent for this in the Netherlands, for example, under the Kolenfond scheme. We therefore come to our final recommendations from the Mapping Our Maritime Future report, surrounding funding for training, with said training not taking place in rest periods, and further recommendations relating to the STCW. Lastly, funds being established to support those who are unable to make the transition. Thank you for your attention during this presentation. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments during our Q&A session. And with that, I'll hand back to our moderator, Helen Kelly.
Thank you very much there, Danny, for your presentation. As you said, we do hope that the results of this survey have sparked ideas and questions amongst our audience. But before we get on to that Q&A session, we would like to play a short highlights video for you that pulls out the main takeaways from this report. It does come with some music, so you might want to adjust your sound at the moment, but I'll ask Danny just to press play on that video. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the video, and Nautilus Federation members can request a copy of this video for use in promoting the research by emailing dmcgowan@nautilusint.org. And don't worry, we will put that email address into the chat as well. So you don't need to be furiously scribbling it down at the minute. But in the meantime, now it is your turn to get involved. We will be opening the floor to your questions in our live Q&A session. Whether you have a question for Mark, Danny, or you want to kind of raise anything else that you've heard today or in the report's findings, please do go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can. If you're struggling at all with the Q&A, feel free to put them in the chat, and we will keep checking both of those two forums, both the chat and the Q&A. So as the host, I'll take my prerogative to ask the first question. And Mark, if you don't mind, I'll bring you back in for this one. Mark, what role does the Nautilus Federation play in shaping policy discussions on decarbonisation and digitalisation? And how effectively are seafarers' voices being heard in these debates?
Okay, sorry, just struggling with the unmute. I think after all these years, I've mastered these buttons. Okay, good question, Helen. And I think firstly, let me just say what the Nautilus Federation is. So many on the call will know because they're actively engaged and part of it. But it's essentially a group of like-minded trade unions. We're specialist trade unions in maritime, but primarily representing the officers on the ships, but not exclusively. Across our membership is very diverse, but I would say broadly that's our space, and we're all affiliated to organisations like the International Transport Workers Federation, or in Europe, for example, we're affiliated to the European Transport Workers Federation. And I mention that affiliation because I think our role is primarily to give voice to these smaller professional specialist unions that represent these key workers in the maritime industry. And by working together on projects like this very project this report, this survey, and garnering the views and experiences of our members, we are then more empowered collectively to represent that voice more loudly and more clearly with greater clarity in organizations like the ITF and the ETF. So that's the first way in which we can insert, to quote Danny and to quote the report, to insert the seafarers' experience and voice into the debate in organizations like the ITF and the ETF, just as examples. That's what we can do with greater force, if you like. Now, the other way, of course, those organizations go on to represent maritime professionals in social dialogue in Europe, for example, but in the ITF, most importantly, in UN agencies like the IMO, and also in the ILO, and that ILO is particularly, I'm particularly passionate about that because that's where we have our tripartite discussions. That's where we take up the challenge of continuously improving the Maritime Labour Convention. And these surveys and reports like this with evidence and direct lived experience is so powerful in those discussions. It's really, really, I can't stress how important it is to go with these reports metaphorically tucked under our arm as we go into the ILO. We'll be going in November for a discussion with the IMO on criminalisation, slightly off piece there a bit, but directly towards the MLC in April next year, where the Special Tripartite Committee will meet to discuss improvements to the MLC. And I'll be using this report remorselessly to drive, in the debate, to use this experience as directly relevant to our argument for a just transition. And in the IMO, has been mentioned by Danny, the STCW is currently going through a comprehensive review. And again, we will use our influence and our commitment to the ITF activities in the IMO and other organizations, such as the International Federation of Shipmasters Associations, where colleagues like David Appleton and Charles Boyle sit on the benches there representing that organization. And again, this is a goldmine of information and relevant experience that we can use in that discussion to argue for that just transition that Danny so brilliantly explained just now. That's a very long answer. You know me, I never do short if I can help it. So apologies that was overdoing it, but hopefully that gives you a sense of how we will use this report and how the Nautilus Federation, as that collective of 21 unions in this specialist space, are stronger and more powerful because we're together and we're sharing our members' direct experience.
Thank you, Mark. No, we do appreciate your fulsome responses, so keep it up. We have got some questions coming through, but I just wanted to say before I put some of those questions to our speakers, Martin Byrne, you've got your hand up. If you could put your question in the Q&A, that would be preferable. If you're having trouble with the Q&A, please feel free to put it in the chat. If we don't see a question coming through from you, we will try and get your intervention across to our speakers in another way if we can, but please do try and use that Q&A and chat first if you can. So thank you very much. Guys, we've got a comment coming in and a question from our colleague Sasha. She's making the point, a very real point that we have actually seen reflected in the results of the survey, that the just transition, it's a concept that, you know, we work with, we talk about all the time. Different international fora are using this concept quite a lot, and yet it's not really a word or a concept that members, seafarers, really recognize. And she's just wondering, and obviously accepts that we need to be aware of this and we need to put our attention to this, but how do we kind of interpret that in a way that our members can understand and put into practice into their workplaces? And Mark, can I ask you, and then perhaps Danny, if we need, I can come to you as well. Mark.
Okay, well, I mean, it's a very pertinent observation, and that's a task for us and maritime unions to explain what this all means and be clear about the terminology. I'm not giving anything away, Helen, I suspect, if I say that we've already had internal strategic discussions around how we turn our goals and objectives into active strategic campaigns and of relevance to members, and explain what it is we're trying to achieve. So I think that's a fair point, and a challenge we have to live up to. The report also, as Danny outlined earlier, makes exactly the same point. So hopefully I covered that point. I was slightly distracted. I was reading a question from one of the members in the Q&A, which I was preparing for, but hopefully I've covered that off, and if not, I'm sure Danny will bail me out.
Danny, yes, would you like to come in on this one?
Thank you. It's something, as Mark said, is a challenge for us as maritime unions, but it's also a challenge for other global organizations, United Nations, Global Compact, and others, because the phrase just transition is something that trips off of our tongue quite easily when we're dealing with policy making and when we're presenting this topic, and that's useful for us in those forums. But as member-led organisations, it's essential that we are able to have our members backing for what we're doing, and that our members understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and that this is for the benefit of them as maritime professionals and for the industry, and ultimately on the decarbonisation journey for the world as a whole, with maritime being responsible for 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Is something that is something that we need to fix, and we're one of the first industries to be fixing it in such a way, in such a wide-reaching forums alongside the UN Global Compact, alongside the other global bodies that we've mentioned. But yeah, absolutely, explaining it to our members, getting more of the seafarers' voice into what we're doing, having this evidence-based report that we can use in those forums is essential. But again, the way we communicate with our members, the way our members understand this work is essential for us all to be able to move forward on this topic together.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Mark, for that. Now, I'd like to move on to a couple of questions that are related and they support each other. I'll start with yours, Jeffrey, and thank you for making the point. The question is, do you think the EU has an obligation to support funding for seafarer training, given that they will introduce Fuel EU next year and have already implemented ETS? Mark, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, well, the short answer is I certainly agree that someone should be paying for the training, and that might sound a bit glib, but what I mean by that is it certainly shouldn't fall on the seafarers. At the very heart of the just transition, what that means to us, and notwithstanding we do need to explain the just transition better with clarity to our members so they understand it the way we understand it, that someone else should be paying for the training that's required. There's another question coming up as well on a very similar theme. It should not fall on the seafarer. That wouldn't be just at all. So someone's going to have to pay, and there is a debate raging around who that should be. Obviously, the ship owners, I wouldn't say the ship owners are saying that they're not responsible for the training costs. I think it does come down to, as Jeffrey has highlighted, the ETS and the funds that will be driven, the income that could come from that and other concepts that are being bandied about at the moment. So that could generate quite significant money. That the understanding is that will be invested back into the industry. And of course, one of the ways that investment should flow is to the seafarers themselves to upskill, reskill, and sustain their careers going forward. Without that, it won't be a just transition. So whether the funding comes directly from the EU, more likely from member states who have significant stakes in maritime, in shipping, in maritime employment, providing and supporting that through, for example, the existing state aid guidelines, which supports incentives and interventions from member states such as tonnage tax. And in the UK, we have, of course, also smart funding support for maritime training, a long-running form of state aid. So I wouldn't, Jeffrey, rule that out. And if it's not directly, then it would be encouraged and supported by the EU towards its member states. But on a global level, it's either ship owners or governments who are going to have to find the resources to support the seafarers. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Mark. And I would like to give voice to David Holz's intervention as well, because I think it's important to, give that voice to the seafarer. And thank you, David, for making your point. He said, having spent my life at sea and now working through an agency, I worry that I will need to spend a lot of money to add the relevant certification to keep working at sea as ships transition to new energy systems with no funding support. Now, Mark, you have obviously touched upon that in your response already, but do you want to respond directly to David on that point?
Yeah, I think I have covered off that for David, but what I would like to say, that worry that David has will be a fear and a concern that many seafarers and maritime professionals will have. And I think that's going to present itself. I think the report is pretty clear on this, as Danny I highlighted earlier. This is something that employers, ship owners, whether they are ship owners employing directly or through their crewing and manning agency, David points out he works through an agency, they're going to have to get to grips with this if it isn't to exacerbate an already pretty critical recruitment and retention crisis. I don't use that word to over-egg the pudding. I think it is a crisis. If we're not already in the middle of it, it's certainly going to be coming very, very soon. And part of that has been, of course, about the experience of seafarers during COVID and how they were treated. I mean, there was in the UK, the first bunch of national statistics produced in the aftermath of COVID showed I think it was an 8 or possibly even a 10% decline in the number of active UK seafarers directly attributable to COVID. So the warnings are there. I hope I'm not giving anything away, Danny, by saying there is another study that we are finalising, which will delve a bit deeper into recruitment and retention. And I would be very surprised if it didn't emphasize the points that we make in this report about that particular aspect of the seafarers' experience. So very good point, David. That fear, I think, that worry is going to be something that the ship owners need to pay attention to. And of course, we will be reminding them of the necessity for them to remove that worry from the minds of our members. Thanks, David. Thanks, Helen.
On the recruitment and retention as well, if I may, Helen, as I've mentioned, the ranking of top issues that the respondents had, with pay, terms and conditions, and so on, being in the top three. And with that recruitment and retention crisis in maritime, we will be building up a lot of skills in our industry as one of the first industries moving to this transition to alternative fuels and beyond. If the ship owners, the employers, the manning agents, and others don't focus on retaining the crews and retaining those skills within our industry through decent work, through pay, through terms and conditions, and so on, through improving the Maritime Labour Convention, then those skills will be rapidly lost to other industries, and we will be stuck in the same situation that we're in now, with seafarers being fed up with the treatment that they're receiving in the industry, and leaving for others. So it's something that ship owners, others, will need to focus on, in addition to this transition, making it a whole sort of holistic approach to the transition to skills retention through decent work.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Mark. And I can see that we have had a couple more people join us in our forum. Thank you very much. You're very welcome. To let you know, we are doing our live Q&A at the moment, and you can contribute by using the Q&A function. You may find that at the top of your screen, but it may also be along the side, depending on what your view is of our webinar today. We have got your question, Martin Byrne, and thank you so much for your patience and for contributing via that Q&A. Martin asked, and this is something I know a lot of the respondents to our to our survey, and our members are worried about as well. So a really pertinent question. Martin says, I am one of those who are in the majority in supporting a just transition, but also skeptical about the ability to get there by 2050. The reason for skepticism is that I am very dubious about the supply of alternative fuels. Does anyone else have concerns about supplying the quantity of alternative fuels for 50,000 to 60,000 trading ships? So a little bit of a technical question there, and maybe slightly outside of our remit, but I know that Mark and Danny will be able to step up. So Mark, can I start with you first, please?
Well, I nothing more than I could expect from Martin to throw me a tricky one on technical, but I do agree with him. First of all, I would say it's a bit outside my field of expertise, but I keep my eyes and ears open and listen a lot to debates and read extensively around these subjects. So I know where that concern is coming from, because we're in this rather strange interregnum between burning dirty oils, for example, primarily, and needing to move to cleaner fuels, and no one really yet having a clear one fuel solution to that conundrum, and various technologies and alternative fuels being promoted, and various shipping companies opting one way or the other. And there's some gateway fuels in terms of the transition. So obviously you're seeing the gas side of the equation being looked at. You're talking about ammonia and hydrogen, and all of that creates problems, as Martin has suggested, around supply and also critically the infrastructure. We're dealing with the transition from wind to steam to coal and steam to oil. Primarily, and all the supply chains and all the, essentially, if I use old terminology, the depots all around the world where you can access those are well established. And now you've got to change, and you've got to, which fuel is it that's going to be the transition, and which is the end game fuel or fuels, and how do we put the infrastructure and get the supply in order to create that critical mass, that tipping point that enables the industry to transition, all the while trying to figure that out, whilst up against a ticking time bomb of this target. Listen, if I was a betting man, I'm not. I'm too tight with my money to wager anybody, but I would be tempted to put a significant wager on the industry, supported by some flag states. And between us, I'm sure we could come up with quite a few of the usual suspects, are very soon going to be talking about extending the deadlines We can't possibly, every single significant change over the 40 years or so I've been involved in this industry have all come down to a week before the deadline, and the ship owners with some flag states demanding that the deadline be extended because it isn't possible, it's not possible, it's just unacceptable, we're going to destroy the industry. So take my wager, this is going to happen again. And 2050, there will be pressure to move it. And there'll be pressure from some who are first movers, because many companies are making the leap. They've made a transition. They've invested in ships. They've got a plan. They are going to be very furious when some others start saying, "Oh, well, we waited, we suck and waited and see. We just thought we'd sit tight and see what happened before we made the move. And now we can't see what the future is," whereas others are making the investments, they're making the change, and they're to be applauded for doing so. So it is heading for some very, very difficult discussions over that. And Martin is right to be skeptical about the supply of those alternative fuels. So yes, fair play, Martin, for highlighting that particular issue.
Yes, thank you. Danny, do you want to come back in and perhaps if you want to make your own intervention, and also I know that Martin has contributed again, so do you want to also let us know what Martin has said in follow-up?
Sure, thanks, Helen. On Mark's point of the deadline likely being extended, I'm sorry to say I agree that I have a similar viewpoint, a similar prognosis. However, it's something that our industry will need to deal with, but also the world does need to deal with. And all we need to do is look at the increasing propensity of extreme weather events. Right now in Central Europe, for example, we're seeing historic flooding that has not been seen on such a scale at all, I believe. We're seeing larger and slower moving typhoons in Asia. We're seeing differences in weather patterns in all parts of the world, and that's not coincidence that we happen to be talking about it at the same time. There might be some climate change deniers out there, but the science is that this is a result of global warming, and so our industry needs to deal with that, but it's something that governments and other industries will need to deal with too. And so that we may not even have the luxury of an extension deadline in the years coming up to 2050. It might be something that becomes more urgent. I don't want to sound too negative about the state of the world, but it is a fact that something needs to be done. On Martin's point about the Net Zero Economy Authority being established in Australia, so it's having a mandate to assist the transition of workers out of coal-fired power stations by retraining for new jobs. That's a perfect example of the just transition, of moving workers, of governments providing for workers to be able to move from an industry that is shutting down, closing down as a result of decarbonisation, and moving into other areas. And Martin's Union, quite rightly, the Australian Institute of Marine and Power Engineers, keen to encourage those workers coming into marine engineering. Absolutely, we will need additional engineers. We need additional seafarers, and in the transition to new and alternative fuels and energy sources, then again these skills will be needed. And so that's a perfect example. We hope, Martin, that you'll be able to share any knowledge, any learning from that with the rest of the Nautilus Federation, so that we can hope to achieve similar setups in our own jurisdictions as well.
Thank you, Danny. Now, I know Mark mentioned it in the answer to some of the questions that we will be using this report in a number of forums in the coming months to really kind of alert the shipping industry to the results and our recommendations. And Danny, I know that you'll be presenting the report at several international forums. Can you share with us some of the details of some of these events that we will be attending and what we hope to achieve from them?
Thanks, Helen. So tomorrow I'll actually be presenting this report to the European Transport Workers Federation Maritime Transport section, sharing that with the unions in Europe, the affiliates that attend that, and also seeking to get their backing to be able to present this at a later date to the European Union Sectoral Social Dialogue Committee. Now that, again, another piece of jargon, an acronym SSDC that we use fairly regularly within Nautilus, that we know what it means, but what that ultimately is the European Commission, the European Community Ship Owners Association, and the European Transport Workers Federation sitting together in a room to discuss the industry, to discuss ways forward, to discuss continuous improvement, and so on. And so this piece of work will be an essential part, we hope, of a future meeting with the Sectoral Social Dialogue Committee, where the European Commission and other interested parties will be able to learn about this important piece of work and hear the seafarers' voice that we're inserting into this conversation. As Mark said, we'll also be using this at various IMO and ILO meetings into the future. We have the COP meeting coming up in Azerbaijan, where we'll be sharing this report with the International Transport Workers Federation to highlight this this work in that arena, but also the possible future COP meetings, the environmental meetings with the UN, the national governments and so on in future years as well, where we will hope to seek a good reception for this kind of work. And so that's really important for Nautilus members, for members of Nautilus Federation affiliates, that they know that their voice is being heard in these multinational arenas, and that we are bringing this conversation to the table for international parties to listen, to understand, and to hopefully act upon what we're presenting to them.
Thank you very much for that, Danny. Okay, so we have got another question incoming from Glyn, and I think, Glyn, you've picked up on some of the things that Mark has said in his presentations and also in his Q&A. So Glyn has said, having just conducted safety inspections on 50 plus vessels in a major energy port in the UK over the last 7 months, he was shocked not to find any UK seafarers and mainly officers and crew from abroad. I think we have a crisis not only in the UK but also in the EU, and it needs to be highlighted to governments as a national and European crisis. Now, Mark, we know you mentioned that we have got a real dip in UK seafarers since the pandemic, and that there are a number of steps that we are doing here around cabotage and other regulations. But do you want to pick that up in a broader context of the Nautilus Federation?
Yeah, well, hello, Glyn. I think, yeah, welcome, Glyn. Nice to see you on the call. Glyn makes a very valid observation, and he's right. It's not just a UK crisis. Hopefully, I did emphasize that it's very much a European and indeed a global crisis. And, well, you know, you've heard me talk before, I think, about sea blindness and how COVID showed that sea blindness has reached really, really excessive levels when governments can lock out seafarers, even their own seafarers, from coming home and leaving them on ships for 17 months to fend for themselves. You really know you're in trouble, and that sea blindness is really systemic and a huge challenge for us, because politicians seem to be ignorant of what it is that's going on, which means they're not paying attention to what's required to address issues like a recruitment and retention crisis. And I could give you countless examples, and forgive me if I give you just this one. We have British officers and ratings supported by the RMT, officers by Nautilus, currently in taking industrial action in the Royal Fleet Auxiliary for the first time in 120 years. Officers took their first ever full day of strike, no work, on the 15th of August, and followed that up with a joint action with the RMT on the 3rd of September. Again, no work. And next week, in fact, starting on Saturday, we will begin a series of actions that will run essentially with officers and ratings downing tools for a full week. Now, this is directly as a consequence of a recruitment and retention crisis, an erosion of the terms and conditions of British seafarers over the past 14 years that's left them 34% worse off than they were in 2010. This has so far failed to get a reaction or a response from the politicians, the very people who need to be fully seized of the problems that Glyn is highlighting, and they're asleep on the job. Of course, the dispute has been 14 years in the making, so it's hard to blame the current government for that. But what I'm so angry about is that the current government doesn't seem to want to do anything to resolve the dispute. The dispute is resolvable. The MOD could fix it right now if they made the offer that I believe they have, but they need clearance from Treasury, and that's what's happening right now. This crisis has many strands, and I've just highlighted the UK example. Glyn is right. This runs across Europe. Danny and I and Sasha, who are these three people on this call who I know are very active in Europe. As Danny said, he's off there tomorrow. I know Sasha will be there as well. And we'll be making this point again, as we have done consistently over the years, that in Europe, we need to address a skills crisis, the decline in the number of European seafarers who are working in the European shipping industry. And Glyn has been on the ships and he's witnessed the decline. And he's absolutely right. And we'll never give up, Glyn, and anybody else on the call who's interested in this issue. We will never give up arguing and fighting for more intervention from governments and more investment from ship owners to support their national flags and their national seafarers. And that's a life mission of mine, and it will continue. When I retire, as colleagues on the call who work for Nautilus and indeed in the Nautilus Federation will continue to champion the industry for our people, in the expectation and desire that the politicians will respond with in a meaningful way. Another short answer. There you go, Helen. You're going to regret asking me.
Not at all. Thank you, Mark. No, I really appreciate that. And thank you, Glyn, for making that intervention. Look, I'm really sad to say that we are coming up towards the end of our session today. Thank you to everybody for being involved. Thank you for your questions and your interventions and for being part of today's discussion. We do hope that the Mapping Our Maritime Future survey serves as a valuable tool for you in representing your members around the world, but please do get in contact if you want any help and any support in that. Remember that you can request a copy of that video if you email dmcgowan@nautilusint.org. And you can also get a full copy of the report. It's available for download via the Nautilus Federation website. And of course, a recording of today's webinar will be available and shared on YouTube via Nautilus TV. So on behalf of the Nautilus Federation, on behalf of Mark and Danny, thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you and goodbye.